My name is Erin and I make Lino-cut prints. I don't have a press, so I print all of my prints by hand, and hand printing has its challenges. So in this video, I want to go over some of the things that go wrong and why, and how I like to get the perfect prints at home without a press. Many of these tips can also be applied to printing with a press if you're so lucky to have one. These are all of the materials that I use for printing at home. I have a wooden spatula and a wooden spoon, a couple of different types of water-soluble printmaking ink, a couple of different brayers, which are rollers for ink, one soft and one is hard, some glass for rolling ink on, and the block I'll be printing. So this ink is the water-soluble oil-based ink from Speedball. I really like this one because it prints very easily and more closely resembles traditional oil-based printmaking inks, but it is much easier to clean up. It takes around 2 to 3 weeks for it to fully dry, so for the sake of this video, I'm using the block printing ink that is water-based and dries within an hour or so. The biggest difference between the two is that you need way less ink with this one, but the process and the tips that I'm giving will work for both types of ink, so this is the ink that we're going with for this video. When rolling out your bed of ink, lay your ink in a straight line about the length of the roller that you're going to use. If you use ink from a tin, spread it out with a palette knife. One of the main things that will influence how your print will turn out is the type of roller that you use. I like a soft rubber roller as opposed to this hard rubber roller. I've never found a hard rubber roller that I like. So I take my brayer, the roller, and grab the front of the line of ink that I laid down, and when I roll back and forth, I lift the roller so the ink spreads out evenly on the glass. Listen to how goopy this sounds. For this example, I want to show you what way too much ink on the glass and roller looks like. One way to know that this is happening is by listening to it. The other way you can tell is by looking at it, and there are way too many raised goopy bumps on this bed of ink. Now I'm rolling the ink onto the surface of my carving, making sure that I apply ink to all areas of the surface of the block. When there is way too much ink, it will quickly appear shiny and it will look pretty goopy overall. When I go to print my inked up block, I carefully place the block into a simple registration key that I've made. If you want to learn more about registration, let me know in the comments and I'll make a video about it. And then once my paper is placed on top, I use my wooden spatula to apply pressure so that the ink transfers from the inked up block to the paper, making sure that I apply pressure to all areas of the block. When too much ink has been applied, areas with small details get filled in, or the ink will slightly spill over the edges of where the block would have been printed. I'm pointing to all of the areas where this has happened in this print, and often the surface of the paper where the ink is will have a lot of texture where it should actually be more flat. So this print is no good. For this print, I want to focus on what too little ink looks like. I just grabbed less of it on the brayer when I started to roll it out on the glass, and this is what it sounds like. There are far less raised bumps on this one, and when I apply it to the block, it is far less goopy looking. I roll ink onto all areas of my block, making sure I've gone back for ink from my ink bed as the ink runs low when I'm rolling it onto the block. And then I will apply pressure with my wooden spatula to transfer the ink to the paper. Realizing that there wasn't enough ink on the ink bed and not enough applied to the carving is pretty easy to spot. The final print will be very light and spotty, just like this one. Before I talk about the right amount of ink and how to make sure you press the paper the right way, I want to talk about a couple of other scenarios. So for this print, I applied the right amount of ink, but I didn't apply enough pressure with my wooden spatula to get the ink to transfer to the paper. It ends up looking pretty spotty and uneven. For this print, I made sure I applied ink evenly to the entire carving, but I didn't apply pressure evenly all over with my wooden spatula. There are areas that did not transfer to the paper, so before lifting the paper, I always make sure that I have applied even pressure to every area that I want to transfer. I am pointing to the areas that didn't transfer properly where I missed applying the right amount of pressure. And it takes a bit of practice with every carving to learn what the right amount of pressure will be. I usually aim for a firm amount of pressure. I don't want to rip my paper, but I want to make sure that the ink really has a chance to transfer to the paper evenly. And depending on what type of linoleum you use, the pressure that you have to apply will vary. So this is the battle between the wooden spatula and the wooden spoon. The wooden spoon has a very small amount of surface area that you can apply pressure to transfer your ink to your paper. And the wooden spatula has that entire flat edged end. So I personally prefer the wooden spatula. I find I get more evenly pressed prints with it and it takes far less time. So on this half of the print, I am applying pressure with my wooden spatula, and then on the other half of this print, I am going to use my wooden spoon and try to spend approximately the same amount of time transferring the ink to the paper. With a wooden spoon, you have to do lots of tiny little circular motions, and with the wooden spatula, I just kind of get to move it back and forth. So when I peel up this print, I'm going to reverse the side that the spatula and the spoon are on, because when I lift it up and flip it over, the side that printed will change. So I'm just changing the wooden spoon and the wooden spatula to match the side that they had printed on, but my wooden spatula side is very evenly printed, and my wooden spoon side, I always end up with a few tiny small areas that didn't get printed as well, just because of that really small surface area that the wooden spoon has. I want to talk a bit about my experience using a hard rubber roller. I've been using a soft rubber roller for all of the other printing in this video, but I've never found a hard rubber roller that I like. So the first thing I don't like is that when I'm rolling out my ink bed, I find the hard rubber roller doesn't grip the ink in the same way and has a hard time spinning as I roll the ink out on the glass, which makes it really difficult to get an even amount of ink on it. Then, when I go to roll it onto my block, it applies the ink very unevenly, and I slowed this clip down so you can see that. So I decided to just roll with it and cover this entire block using my hard rubber roller and then make a print from it, just to show you the difficulty that I have with the hard rubber roller applying the ink so unevenly to my block, and then just a little trick that you can use to kind of fix that problem. Often I will lift only part of the paper up to check the quality of my print before I remove it from the block entirely. So if there are spots that did not print evenly, or I didn't have quite enough ink in a certain area, if I do this peek very carefully, I can apply a very small amount of ink onto my block again, lay that part of my paper back down, and press it again. I usually check both ends of my prints before entirely lifting off of the block. So here we go, that print that was totally messed up because of my hard rubber roller applying the ink so unevenly to my print is now a good print that I'm happy with now that I use this little peeking method to make sure that it printed evenly. Okay, so finally I'm going to talk about what the right amount of ink looks like. So when I roll out my ink bed, I am trying to get an even and thin layer of ink rolled out. I'm looking for a very specific hissing sound like this. There should be a small amount of texture or bumpiness to the ink bed, but not as much as when there was way too much ink being rolled out onto it. It looks like this. When I roll the ink onto the block, I make sure to apply a thin, even layer of ink over the entire carving. I go back to my ink bed a couple of times, depending on the size of the carving, to make sure the ink has been applied evenly. I try not to go over the same area when I pick up more ink so I don't end up over applying, but it takes a bit of practice to learn how much ink each carving needs, which is why I always take a peek at the print before peeling it off after printing. After I line my block up with my registration, I very carefully place my paper on top, and then I use my wooden spatula to apply pressure to the entire surface of my paper or the entire area where it will be printed. And I just take my time to slowly go over the entire carving to make sure that I have in fact gotten everywhere that needs to be printed. I usually go over it a couple of times just to make sure, but again, that's why I usually take a peek at my print before I peel it off of the carving after printing. And finally, a print that turned out well with the right amount of ink and pressure. But I do have one more little trick to share. So because I've been messing around with printing this carving in this video, some of the small areas of detail have filled in with ink. So I use a pencil or a small object and scrape or scoop out the ink that's gotten into these areas. That way, when I continue printing, I will continue to get prints with all the details that I want them to have. Now that everything is flowing well and I have the right amount of ink and have figured out the right amount of pressure to apply to the block, I can make an addition of prints. And if you want to learn more about additioning, let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you found these hand printing tips for Lino-cuts helpful. If you did, please consider subscribing to my channel to see future videos. This print is called Selkies and is available in my online shop, which I've left a link to in the description box for this video. If you check it out, there are many other Lino-cuts I've made there as well. Thanks for watching and see you next time.